March 19, 1978. Studio 1, NBC Burbank. The red camera light stayed on when it shouldn't have. The audience had stopped laughing. Not gradually, the way laughter naturally fades into silence, but suddenly, as if someone had cut the power to a circuit. Johnny Carson stood at center stage, just left of his desk, his body turned slightly toward camera 2 in a posture that 70 million Americans had learned to read like a language. His right hand held the microphone at chest level, loose but not careless. His left hand hung at his side. The applause sign, mounted above the audience in the familiar grid of light bulbs, had gone dark 30 seconds earlier. But the silence had nothing to do with signage. Carson had asked a question. The guest, a young comedian whose name would appear in television retrospectives for decades afterward, always attached to this moment, had answered in a way that violated an unwritten rule. Not a rule about language or content, a rule about territory, about who controlled the rhythm of live television at 10:30 on a Tuesday night in America. The guest had interrupted Carson mid-sentence, not with a joke, but with a correction, a factual correction. On live television, in front of an audience that had come to see Johnny Carson, not to witness someone explain to Johnny Carson that he had misremembered a detail about a film from 1952. Carson stopped. He did not react the way amateurs react when interrupted, with visible irritation or a cutting remark designed to re-establish dominance. He simply stopped. The microphone stayed at his chest. His expression did not change. He looked at the guest the way a teacher looks at a student who has just demonstrated that they do not understand the assignment. The silence extended into a second measure, then a third. The audience, trained by 17 years of watching Carson navigate live television, recognized the silence as a form of communication. They did not laugh. They did not applaud. They waited. Then Carson did something that producers would discuss in green rooms and industry panels for years. He looked directly at the camera, not at camera 2, which was hot, but at camera 1, positioned stage left, and said quietly, almost conversationally, "Cut." He did not shout it. He did not signal to the booth. He said it as if you were asking someone to pass the salt. The word hung in the air for a moment. The audience heard it. The guest heard it. The director, seated in the control booth with his hand on the switcher, heard it through the audio feed. But the cameras did not cut. The red light on camera 2 stayed on. The broadcast continued, because Johnny Carson did not actually control the cameras. He only seemed to. What appearing on The Tonight Show meant in 1978 cannot be understood through modern metrics. There was no viral clip, no social media amplification, no podcast dissection the following morning. The Tonight Show was not one option among many. It was the singular mechanism by which American culture decided who mattered. A comedian could perform in clubs for a decade and remain regionally known. Or they could perform 6 minutes on Carson's stage and become nationally viable by sunrise. Film studios scheduled releases around Tonight Show bookings. Publishers timed book launches to Carson interviews. Political campaigns understood that 5 minutes with Carson reached more voters than a month of rallies.
Carson himself understood this power in a way that made him dangerous to misread. He was not a kingmaker in the sense of actively promoting careers, though he did that, calling over comedians after their sets to sit on the couch, which was the industry equivalent of a papal blessing. He was dangerous because he could end momentum with silence. A comedian who failed on Carson's stage did not simply have a bad set. They had failed in front of the only audience that mattered, and the failure was public, immediate, and total. Carson did not need to say anything. The absence of his laughter was the review. This is why the guest's interruption mattered. It was not about the factual correction. It was about misunderstanding the architecture of the show. The Tonight Show was not a conversation between equals. It was a performance of a conversation, and Carson was the only person in the room who decided when the performance shifted. The audience understood this instinctively. The guest did not. The control booth, suspended above the studio floor, received Carson's instruction in real time. The director, a 20-year NBC veteran who had worked Carson shows since the New York days, later described the moment in an interview with a television archive project in 1991. He did not use the word dilemma, but that is what he meant. Carson had said cut on a live broadcast. The word had gone out over the air, the audience had heard it, but cutting to commercial in the middle of a segment, without a scripted transition, without Carson's usual gesture toward camera one and the familiar lean back that signaled an ad break, this would communicate something else entirely. It would communicate that Carson had lost control, that the show had malfunctioned, that live television could break. The director made a decision in the span of 2 seconds. He did not cut. He kept camera 2 hot. He let the silence run. In the control booth, this decision felt enormous. On television, it lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time in live television. It is enough time for an audience to become uncomfortable, enough time for a guest to realize they have made an error they cannot undo, enough time for Johnny Carson to decide what kind of lesson this moment would become. Carson did not look at the guest. He looked at the camera. Not playing to it, but acknowledging it, the way a carpenter acknowledges a tool. Then he turned back to the guest, smiled slightly, and said, "We're still here." The audience laughed, not politely. They laughed with relief, because Carson had decided to resolve the moment with humor instead of cruelty. The guest laughed too, though later interviews suggest he did not fully understand what had happened. Carson moved on to the next question. The segment continued. The show aired without interruption. But the moment entered television lore not because of what happened on camera, but because of what Carson had revealed about the machinery of live television. He had tested the boundary between performance and control, between the appearance of authority and its actual limits. He had said cut, knowing the cameras would not cut, and in doing so, he had demonstrated that his power was not technical, it was atmospheric. The audience believed he could stop the show. The guest believed it, and for 4 seconds, that belief was more real than the cameras. The red camera light is not a neutral object. It is a signal, a marker of attention, a reminder that what happens in the studio is simultaneously happening in 20 million living rooms across 4 time zones. Carson had built his career on an acute awareness of that light. Other hosts performed for the audience in the room. Carson performed for the camera, which meant he performed for the individual viewer at home, alone or with family, watching him the way they might watch a neighbor through a window. He was intimate without being intrusive, present without being demanding. The camera loved him because he loved it back, in the specific way that professionals love their tools, with respect, precision, and an understanding of what the tool could do if mishandled.
When Carson said cut, he was not speaking to the director. He was speaking to the audience through the camera. He was saying, I could stop this. I could end this segment, this moment, this guest's career trajectory with a word. But I won't, because I am in control, and control means choosing not to use the power you have. This is what separated Carson from his predecessors and his imitators. Steve Allen had been anarchic. Jack Paar had been emotional. Carson was restrained. He wielded silence the way a surgeon wields a scalpel, precisely, economically, and only when necessary. The guest recovered. The segment ended. Carson shook his hand during the commercial break and said something the guest later described as kind but not warm. The show continued through 2 more segments, a musical performance and Carson's closing monologue. The next morning, Variety did not mention the moment. Television critics writing their weekly columns did not flag it. In 1978, there was no apparatus for dissecting 4-second silences on late-night television. The moment existed only in the memory of the people who had watched it live, and in the private conversations of television professionals who understood what they had seen. But memory is how television history is written. Not through ratings or reviews, but through the moments that producers and performers carry with them, the moments they reference when teaching younger colleagues how live television works. The story of Carson saying cut became a parable.
It was told in green rooms and writers' rooms and film school seminars. It was told as a lesson about control, about the difference between having power and demonstrating it. It was told as a reminder that live television is a negotiation between what the audience sees and what the machinery allows, and that the best performers understand the machinery well enough to make it invisible. Carson himself rarely discussed the moment. In interviews toward the end of his tenure, when journalists asked about memorable shows or difficult guests, he tended to deflect with humor or redirect to other topics. He was not interested in explaining his craft, he was interested in executing it. This was part of his authority. He did not need to narrate his decisions. The decisions spoke for themselves, in real time, on live television, in front of audiences who might not understand the technique, but who recognized mastery when they saw it. The guest, interviewed years later for a retrospective documentary, described the moment with a mixture of embarrassment and respect. He said Carson had taught him something about performance that night, something about listening, about rhythm, about understanding that a talk show is not a conversation, but a constructed artifact that resembles a conversation. He said he had gone into the segment thinking his job was to be interesting. He left understanding that his job was to make Carson look good. This is what every successful Tonight Show guest learned, either instinctively or through experience. The show was not about them, it was about Johnny Carson. Their role was to provide him with material, with opportunities to react, to joke, to steer. If they did that well, they were invited back. If they did not, they were thanked politely and never rebooked.
Television in the 1970s was a medium of trust. There were 3 networks. Most households received between 5 and 10 channels. The evening news was a shared national experience. The Tonight Show was a shared national ritual. Carson's authority derived not from celebrity, though he was extraordinarily famous, but from consistency. He was on the air 5 nights a week, 50 weeks a year, for 3 decades. Americans watched him more regularly than they saw their own extended families. He became a fixture, a constant, a presence that did not demand attention but received it anyway because he had earned it through repetition and reliability. This is why the cut moment mattered beyond its immediate drama. It was a reminder that even the most controlled performances are performances, that live television is always one sentence away from chaos, that the appearance of ease, Carson's effortless timing, his casual delivery, his ability to salvage a dying joke or redirect a rambling guest, was the result of relentless discipline and an almost architectural understanding of how television worked. The audience did not need to know this consciously, they felt it. They trusted Carson because he never let them see the machinery. And on the rare occasion when the machinery became visible, when he said cut and the cameras did not cut, he turned even that into part of the performance. The red camera light blinked off at 11:27. The audience filed out through the studio doors into the Burbank parking lot. The guest returned to his hotel and called his manager, unsure whether the segment had gone well. Carson walked back to his dressing room, removed his jacket, and sat down to review notes for the following night's show. The director logged the episode and moved on to prep for the next taping. The moment, for everyone involved, was over. But the moment had already begun its second life, the life that moments from live television live when they become stories, when they get passed from one generation of television professionals to the next, when they become part of the unwritten manual for how to survive on camera. The story of Johnny Carson saying cut was never about whether the cameras obeyed. It was about the fact that for 4 seconds, everyone believed they might. And in live television, belief is the only currency that matters. The red light stays on, the audience is watching, and somewhere in Burbank or New York or in 100 cities across the country, someone is learning that control is not about stopping the show. It is about making everyone think you could and choosing not to. That was Johnny Carson's gift. Not that he made it look easy, but that he made easy look like enough.